The millionaire's son choked in front of everyone, and no one noticed, except the cleaning lady. Within seconds, she crossed the room and saved the child without asking for permission. Instead of gratitude, she was accused of overreacting and exposed to the elite's judgment. But what happened next was unbelievable and changed the fate of that household forever. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the Blackwood Montgomery estate gleamed on the New York City night. Located in the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut, the imposing three-story residence, with its meticulously manicured gardens and Italian marble fountain, represented the pinnacle of Theodore Blackwood Montgomery's business success, one of the wealthiest men in the United States. That Friday night, Theodore was hosting some of the most important names in the American business scene at his home. The reason? The signing of a billion-dollar deal that would expand his technology empire throughout North America. The dining table, a sumptuous piece of solid wood furniture with seating for 20, was impeccably set. Crystals sparkled under the light of the immense French chandelier. Silver cutlery reflected the glow of strategically placed candles, and arrangements of rare orchids completed the sophisticated decor. Louisa, Theodore's wife of 15 years, supervised every detail with eagle eyes. Tall, slender, with perfectly brushed blonde hair and wearing a designer dress that cost a small fortune, she personified elegance and refinement. Her obsession with control was notorious among all the staff in the mansion. Roberta, make sure the napkins are folded exactly as I showed you, and tell the chef that the red wine must be served at room temperature. Not a degree more, not a degree less, Louisa instructed the housekeeper, who nodded quickly before disappearing in the direction of the kitchen. At the center of all this artificial perfection was Gustav, the couple's only child, a 9-year-old boy who looked like a miniature version of his father. He wore a custom-made suit, his brown hair perfectly combed with gel, and sat rigidly in his chair, practicing what his mother called heirs posture. "Remember the rules." "Gustav," Louisa whispered, adjusting her son's bow tie. "Keep your back straight, don't speak unless spoken to. Use the correct cutlery for each dish, and under no circumstances ask to leave the table before all guests have finished." The boy nodded, his brown eyes reflecting more apprehension than enthusiasm. For Gustav, these occasions were like long sessions of torture. He had to behave like an adult, when all he wanted was to be playing video games or romping with his dog, Thor. In another part of the mansion, far from the watchful eyes of the family, Mrs. Josephine was preparing for another night of work. At 45, with her robust body shaped by years of physical labor, gray hair always pulled back in a simple bun, and hands calloused by time, she had been responsible for cleaning the house for over a decade. Originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, she had moved to New York City in search of better opportunities for her twin children, now university students thanks to her daily toil. Unlike the other staff in the mansion, Josephine was not easily intimidated. She respected the hierarchy, of course, but maintained a quiet dignity that sometimes bothered Louisa. That night her role would be simple: remain discreet, remove plates between courses, and ensure everything was clean and in order. The guests began to arrive promptly at 8 o'clock. Luxurious cars pulled up to the circular driveway of the mansion, dropping off businessmen, politicians, and their respective wives dressed in haute couture. Theodore, a 50-year-old man, tall with graying temples and a physique maintained by daily sessions with a personal trainer, greeted everyone with his calculated businessman's smile. Dinner was served at 9 sharp. The impeccably dressed team of waiters moved synchronously through the dining room, serving a 7-course menu prepared by the French chef hired especially for the occasion. Conversations flowed about stocks, investments, corporate mergers, and occasionally about the latest trips to exotic destinations that few Americans could dream of visiting. Gustav watched everything with attentive eyes, trying to absorb that adult world while mechanically chewing the food on his plate. The main course was an elaborate cut of Wagyu beef, accompanied by truffle sauce and organic vegetables grown on the family farm in the Connecticut countryside. It was then, as he tried to swallow a particularly large piece of meat, that Gustav felt something strange. His throat seemed to have closed. He tried to swallow again without success. A feeling of panic began to grow as he realized he couldn't breathe. The bow tie, previously just uncomfortable, now seemed to be strangling him. His eyes widened in despair. His small hands automatically went to his neck in a universal gesture of choking. He looked at his parents, but they were engrossed in conversation. The businessman to his right was animatedly talking about a recent trip to Dubai, while his mother nodded with a polished smile. Gustav tried to tap his mother's arm, but the movement was weak. No one noticed his growing despair. The air in his lungs began to run out, and a dizzying sensation set in. It was then that his eyes met those of Mrs. Josephine, who was discreetly collecting some plates from the other side of the table. In seconds, the woman's expression changed from concentration to full alert. Without hesitation, Josephine left the stack of plates on the nearest sideboard and ran towards the boy, completely ignoring the protocol of discretion required of staff. "The boy is choking!" she exclaimed in a firm voice, breaking the bubble of superficial conversations. Theodore and Louisa turned sharply, only to see their son with his face already purplish and his eyes bulging in panic. "My God, Gustav!" Louisa cried, jumping up. "Someone do something!" Confusion set in. One of the guests suggested giving the boy water. Another recommended slapping him on the back. Theodore, paralyzed by shock, merely watched his son losing consciousness with each passing second. It was at this moment that Mrs. Josephine took decisive action. She firmly pushed away the guests who were uselessly crowding around the boy, positioned herself behind Gustav, and with precise movements that demonstrated technical knowledge, applied the Heimlich maneuver. "Excuse me, I need space," she said with an authority that no one dared to question. On the first abdominal compression, nothing happened. On the second, Gustav began to go limp. On the third, tears streamed down Louisa's face, who watched the scene in horror. On the fourth compression, finally, the piece of meat was expelled, flying over the table and landing on the imported linen tablecloth. A guttural sound of air filling his lungs echoed through the dining room. Color began to return to Gustav's face, who was breathing heavily, clinging to Mrs. Josephine's arms as if they were his only anchor in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 pairs of eyes watched in astonishment. A domestic worker holding the heir to an empire, having just saved him from a terrible fate. The social order of that house, so rigidly maintained by Louisa, had been completely subverted in a matter of seconds, and it was at that moment, as Gustav regained his breath in Josephine's arms, that the tension broke in an unexpected way. "What do you think you're doing?" Louisa's sharp voice cut through the silence. "You could have hurt my son with that." That aggressive approach. All eyes turned to the lady of the house, including Theodore's, who seemed not to recognize his own wife at that moment. "Louisa, for God's sake, she just saved Gustav's life," he exclaimed, finally regaining his voice. "You don't know that," Louisa retorted, her face a mask of indignation. "He could have expelled the food himself. This woman acted rashly and with unnecessary violence." Mrs. Josephine, still holding Gustav, who was now sobbing softly, remained calm, but her dark eyes shone with a mixture of indignation and determination. "Madam, with all due respect, your son was choking. Without immediate intervention, in less than 2 minutes he would have lost consciousness. In 4 minutes, the brain begins to suffer irreversible damage from lack of oxygen. I did what anyone with basic first aid training would do." The entire room held its breath. Never in all the years of working in the Blackwood Montgomery mansion had an employee spoken to Louisa like that. The atmosphere in the dining room was suffocating. The guests exchanged embarrassed glances, divided between admiration for the employee's courage and hierarchical respect for the lady of the house. Theodore, realizing the disastrous potential of the situation, rose with a quiet authority he rarely displayed at home. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the incident. I suggest we move to the drawing room for coffee and liqueurs while my son recovers," he announced in a controlled voice, assuming the role he exercised daily on the boards of his companies. The guests promptly followed his suggestion, relieved to escape the rising tension. As they left, Theodore approached Gustav, who was still clinging to Mrs. Josephine as if he feared that by letting go of her, he might again feel that terrible sensation of choking. "Son, are you all right?" he asked, kneeling to be at the boy's height. The genuine concern on his face was rare, especially in front of other people. Gustav nodded, still unable to speak, his eyes red from crying. Louisa remained standing, rigid as a statue, her lips pressed into a thin line, clearly divided between concern for her son and indignation at the cleaner's behavior. "Louisa, please take Gustav upstairs." "He needs to rest," Theodore requested, in a tone that allowed no argument. Reluctantly, Louisa extended her hand to her son, who hesitated before letting go of Mrs. Josephine. Before leaving, the boy looked one last time at the woman who had saved him and whispered an almost inaudible "thank you," which brought tears to the eyes of the woman from New Orleans. As Louisa and Gustav left, Theodore turned to Josephine. "Josephine, I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my son." The woman nodded, maintaining the dignity that always characterized her. "Sir, I only did what anyone should do. The boy needed help. I knew how to help." "As for my wife?" Theodore began, clearly uncomfortable. "You don't need to explain, sir," Josephine interrupted. "I know it was a shock for everyone. Mrs. Louisa was scared. It's natural to react that way." Theodore looked at the employee with a mixture of surprise and respect. How much generosity there was in that woman, who even after being publicly accused, still found understanding for Louisa's attitude. "Even so, I want you to know that I don't agree with what was said, and I intend to clarify this situation completely," he affirmed with determination. "Now please take the rest of the night off. You've been through a stressful situation." "With all due respect, sir, I prefer to continue my work. The guests are still here and there's a lot to tidy up," Josephine replied, adjusting her uniform, which was wrinkled from the interaction with Gustav. Theodore nodded, recognizing the dignity of that woman who, even after saving his son and being unjustly accused, maintained her professionalism. "As you prefer. But this conversation is not over," he stated, before joining the guests in the drawing room. The night continued with an underlying tension. Smiles were forced, conversations artificial, and everyone avoided mentioning the incident as if a tacit agreement of silence had been established. Around 11 at night, the guests began to depart, each expressing wishes for Gustav's recovery, who remained in his room under his mother's watchful care. When the last guest left, Theodore ascended the mansion's stairs with heavy steps. He found Louisa sitting on the edge of Gustav's bed, who had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the trauma. "How is he?" he asked in a low voice. "Sleeping now." "He was nervous, had a nightmare," she replied dryly. Theodore took a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable conversation. "Louisa, we need to talk about what happened downstairs." "There's nothing to talk about," she cut him off, standing up and heading for the door. "That woman overstepped all boundaries. Tomorrow I will arrange for her replacement." Theodore blocked her path, a spark of anger igniting in his usually calculating eyes. "You will do no such thing. That woman saved our son while we were too busy with our guest to notice he was choking right under our noses." The truth of his words hit Louisa like a slap. For a moment her mask of perfection wavered, revealing guilt and shame. But as quickly as they appeared, these emotions were replaced by the defensive indignation that was her comfort zone. "You can't be serious. You're going to defend a cleaner who humiliated your wife in front of the most powerful men in the country. What kind of message does that send, Theodore? That employees can do whatever they please?" "The message it sends," he replied, controlling his voice so as not to wake his son, "is that we value life above appearances, and that we recognize when we owe gratitude." Louisa shook her head, incredulous. "You're being emotional, something completely out of character for you. Tomorrow, when you think clearly, you'll see I'm right." "No, Louisa, this time you've gone too far," Theodore retorted. "And to prove how right I am, let's go to my office right now." Without waiting for a response, he headed to the spacious office at the end of the corridor, knowing his wife would follow, if only to continue the argument. Once inside, Theodore activated a discreet panel on the wall, revealing a computer screen connected to the mansion's elaborate security system. "What are you doing?" Louisa asked, irritated by the change of subject. "Showing you the truth," he replied simply, typing commands on the keyboard. "As you well know, all common areas of the house are monitored by high-definition cameras, including the dining room." Understanding slowly dawned on Louisa's face, replacing irritation with apprehension. On the screen, an image of the dining room appeared, captured from an angle that showed the entire table. Theodore fast-forwarded the recording to moments before the incident. There they all were, chatting animatedly, crystal glasses in hand, smiles on their faces. And there was Gustav sitting rigidly among the adults, clearly out of place. "Watch closely," Theodore instructed, slowing down the playback. The recording showed the exact moment Gustav put a large piece of meat in his mouth. His discomfort was evident as he tried to chew. Then the change in his expression, wide eyes growing panic, hands desperately going to his neck. And no one, absolutely no one at the table noticed. Except Mrs. Josephine, who from across the room while collecting plates immediately noticed the danger. The recording clearly showed her reaction, instant recognition, dropping the plates, running towards the boy. Her intervention was quick, technical, and undoubtedly life-saving. The security system even captured the audio, including Gustav's terrible sound of futilely trying to breathe, and then the audible relief when the piece of meat was expelled. And then, devastatingly clear, Louisa's accusation, "What do you think you're doing? You could have hurt my son with that aggressive approach." Theodore paused the recording and turned to his wife. Louisa was pale, her eyes fixed on the frozen image of Gustav in Mrs. Josephine's arms. "How long?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "What? How long was he? Like that, before anyone noticed?" Theodore consulted the time counter in the corner of the screen. 42 seconds from the first visible sign of choking until Josephine's intervention. 42 seconds, an eternity when one cannot breathe. Louisa sat heavily in the nearest chair, reality finally penetrating her armor of denial. "My God," she murmured. He could have." "Yes," Theodore confirmed, without completing the terrible sentence. "And we would have been responsible for our distraction, for our distorted priorities." Louisa covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling in a silent cry that seemed to come from the depths of her being. It was a sound Theodore hadn't heard in years, perhaps since Gustav's birth. The sound of a real vulnerable Louisa, stripped of the social armor she wore as a second skin. After a few minutes, she lifted her face, her eyes red, her makeup smudged. "How could I have been so blind, so unfair?" "We were all blind tonight, Louisa," Theodore replied, sitting beside her. "Blind to our own son's needs, but Josephine saw and acted. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer charged with tension, but with painful self-reflection. "I need to apologize to her," Louisa finally said. "First thing tomorrow." "Yes, you do," Theodore agreed, "but there's something else we need to do." Louisa looked at her husband, intrigued. "What?" "Find out how Josephine knew exactly what to do. That wasn't intuition or luck. She knew precisely how to act in an emergency, with a technique none of us knew." On the frozen screen, the image of Mrs. Josephine firmly holding Gustav continued to observe them, like a silent testimony to a truth they had long neglected. Within that mansion full of material wealth, the most valuable person that night had been a simple woman from the South, whose hands, calloused by hard work, held her son's life when all else failed. The next morning dawned with a different atmosphere in the Blackwood Montgomery mansion. The usual silence was replaced by a reflective quietness, as if the entire house was still processing the events of the previous night. Gustav slept late, exhausted by the trauma. When he finally came down for breakfast, he found his parents sitting at the kitchen table, an extraordinary fact in itself, as the couple usually had breakfast in separate locations. Theodore in his office, between calls and emails, and Louisa, on the terrace, flipping through decorating magazines while nibbling toast. "Good morning, son," Theodore greeted, standing to hug the boy, another unusual gesture in the family's routine, where physical displays of affection were rare and calculated. Gustav accepted the hug with surprise, but soon nestled into his father's arms. When they separated, he saw that his mother's eyes were swollen, as if she had cried during the night. "How are you feeling, dear?" Louisa asked, trying to smile. "I'm fine, Mom," the boy replied, sitting down. "Where is Mrs. Josephine?" question, simple and direct as only a child's could be, caught the couple by surprise. It was unusual for Gustav to ask about an employee. "She must be working somewhere in the house," Theodore replied. "Why?" "I want to thank her." "Properly," the boy explained, pouring himself orange juice. "She saved my life." Louisa and Theodore exchanged glances. Their son's frankness confronted them with their own hypocrisy. While they had spent the night arguing and reproaching themselves, Gustav knew exactly what needed to be done. A simple thank you. "You're right, son," Louisa acknowledged, her voice betraying an uncharacteristic emotion. "We all owe Mrs. Josephine our thanks." "Actually," Theodore interjected, "I'd like to speak with her first. There are some questions I need to ask." Half an hour later, Mrs. Josephine was called to Theodore's office. She entered with her usual posture, dignified, respectful, but never subservient. She wore her usual uniform, and nothing in her appearance or behavior indicated that less than 12 hours earlier, she had been at the center of a drama that had irrevocably changed the dynamic of that house. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked, remaining standing near the door. "Yes, Josephine." "Please sit down," Theodore invited, indicating a leather armchair opposite his desk, an invitation he had never extended to any employee of the house. After a moment of hesitation, she accepted, sitting on the edge of the armchair, her hands crossed in her lap. "First of all," Theodore began, "I want to formally thank you for what you did yesterday. You saved my son when all of us failed to perceive the danger." Josephine nodded, accepting the words without false modesty. "Anyone would have done the same." "Sir." "No, Josephine, that's precisely the point. Not anyone would have done the same," Theodore retorted, leaning forward. "I watched the recording several times during the night. What you did wasn't just courage, it was technique. You knew exactly what you were doing." A brief flicker of sadness crossed the woman's eyes so quickly it almost went unnoticed. "I learned the hard way, sir," she replied after a pause. 6 years ago I lost my younger brother Anthony, in very similar circumstances." The confession surprised Theodore, who had never been interested in his employees' personal lives beyond what was necessary to hire them. "I'm sorry," he said. "Genuinely." Josephine took a deep breath, as if preparing to relive a painful memory. "We were at a family barbecue in New Orleans. Anthony choked on a piece of meat. Everyone panicked, including me. We tried to help as best we could, slaps on the back, offering water, all wrong. When the ambulance finally arrived, it was too late." Theodore felt a knot in his throat imagining the scene, so similar to what almost happened to his own son. 3 days after the funeral, I promised myself I would never feel so helpless again, Josephine continued, her voice now firm. I enrolled in every first aid course I could find. I used my days off to train with volunteer firefighters. I learned about choking, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, treating seizure victims, controlling hemorrhages, everything that could save a life in an emergency situation. She opened the simple bag she always carried and pulled out a small, spiral-bound manual. This goes everywhere with me. I review it monthly, so I never forget, because I know that in emergencies, minutes, sometimes seconds, make all the difference. Theodore took the manual and flipped through it, impressed by the marginal notes, the pages worn from much handling, the highlighted parts. That small book represented a commitment that he, with all his framed diplomas and certificates on the wall, had never made to anything that didn't generate financial profit. "Why did you never tell us about this?" he asked, returning the manual. Josephine gave a sad smile. "You never asked." "Mr. Montgomery, and with all due respect, I doubt you would have been interested in the story of a cleaner from the South." The frankness of the answer hit Theodore like a slap of reality. It was true. In 10 years of working in the house, he barely knew Josephine had children, let alone knew her personal history. "You're right," he acknowledged, surprising himself with the admission. "And that will change starting today." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was Louisa, accompanied by Gustav. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, still visibly uncomfortable, but Gustav insisted on speaking with Mrs. Josephine. The boy, without waiting for permission, ran to the employee and, in a spontaneous gesture only a child could make, hugged her tightly. "Thank you for saving me." "Mrs. Josephine," he said with a choked voice. Josephine, momentarily disconcerted by the display of affection, soon enveloped the boy in her robust arms. "There's nothing to thank me for, my dear. I'm glad you're all right." Louisa, watching the scene, struggled with her own emotions. She approached slowly, and when Josephine and Gustav separated, looked the employee in the eyes. "Josephine, I need to apologize for the way I reacted yesterday," she said, the words coming out with difficulty. "It was unfair and ungrateful of me. You saved my son, and I acted terribly." The sincerity of the apology was palpable. For Louisa Blackwood Montgomery, a woman who had built her identity around perfection and control, admitting a mistake publicly was almost as difficult as breathing without oxygen. "Mrs. Louisa," Josephine replied with dignity, "I understand it was a very stressful moment. Any mother would have been distraught seeing her child in that situation. You are forgiven." Theodore watched the interaction with a mixture of pride in his wife's humility and admiration for Josephine's generosity. It was then that he made a decision that would forever change the dynamic of that house. "Josephine, after hearing your story and witnessing your skills, I cannot let this knowledge remain restricted to just you," he declared, standing up. "I want to propose something. Starting today, you will take on a new role in this house." Everyone looked at him, surprised. "In addition to your normal duties, you will be our emergency coordinator. You will be responsible for training all staff and the family in first aid. You will have the authority to implement safety protocols, and everyone, including Louisa and me, will follow your guidance in this area." The proposal was revolutionary. Never before had an employee received such a level of authority and responsibility in the rigid hierarchy of the mansion. "This new role, of course, will come with a substantial increase in your salary," Theodore continued. "And I want you to have your own space to conduct training and store emergency equipment." Josephine was genuinely surprised. She did not expect recognition, much less a promotion. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you accept," Louisa interjected, to everyone's surprise. "Please, it would be an honor to have someone with your knowledge guiding us." The use of the word honor, coming from Louisa, who had always treated employees with polite indifference, demonstrated how much the dynamic had changed. "In that case, I accept," Josephine replied, a slight smile illuminating her normally serious face. "With one condition." "What is it?" Theodore asked, intrigued. "That the first to receive full training be Gustav," she said, looking at the boy. "Children can also save lives, and I'm sure he would be an excellent learner." Gustav's eyes sparkled at the suggestion. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen and valued in that house. "I want to learn everything, Mrs. Josephine," he exclaimed enthusiastically. "I want to be just like you." Louisa, who would normally discourage such enthusiasm for something so inappropriate for an heir, merely smiled, recognizing the wisdom of Josephine's request. What better example could her son have than a person who turned a personal tragedy into a commitment to the lives of others? "It's agreed, then," Theodore concluded, extending his hand to seal the formal agreement with Josephine. "From today, our house will have new values and priorities." When their hands met in a firm handshake, something invisible but powerful changed in the air of that mansion. The walls that separated those above and those below began to dissolve, not completely, but enough to allow humanity, that force that equalizes everyone, regardless of bank account or surname, to flow freely. No one could predict at that moment how much this simple change in the house's hierarchy would affect each of them in the following months. The seeds of a profound transformation had been planted and would soon begin to germinate, bearing fruits none of them had ever imagined possible within those walls of privilege. 2 weeks had passed since the implementation of the changes in the Blackwood Montgomery mansion. The old game room, rarely used on the 3rd floor, had been transformed into an improvised training center. On the walls, once decorated with expensive and personally meaningless paintings, now hung illustrative posters about emergency procedures. In the center, a spacious open area allowed for the practice of first aid maneuvers. Mrs. Josephine embraced her new role with the same efficiency that characterized all her work. She set up a detailed training schedule, separated groups by function and area of activity, and established clear protocols to be followed in different types of emergencies. Her personal manual, previously discreetly kept in her bag, was now available in bound copies strategically distributed throughout the house. Surprisingly, Gustav became her most dedicated student. Every afternoon after school, he would rush to the training center for his daily first aid lesson. Under Josephine's patient tutelage, the boy learned quickly, not only the techniques but also the calm and precision required in crisis situations. "Very good, Gustav," Josephine exclaimed as she watched the boy perfectly perform the Heimlich maneuver on a training mannequin. "Your hands are in the exact position." The boy's face lit up with the compliment. It was visible how he flourished under the positive attention of someone who valued him for his skills, not for his surname or future role as an heir. "Mrs. Josephine, when will I learn about defibrillators?" he asked, eager to expand his knowledge. "Calm down, young rescuer," she laughed, affectionately ruffling his hair, a gesture she would never have dared to make weeks before. "One step at a time. First, we master the basic techniques that don't require equipment. Then we move on to the devices." Outside the room, Theodore watched the interaction with a discreet smile. His son's transformation in those 2 weeks was impressive. The shy, tense boy who constantly needed to be reminded about heir's posture had given way to a confident, curious and visibly happier child. Theodore kept his word regarding the changes in the house. The first batch of emergency equipment had already been installed. First aid kits at strategic points, automatic defibrillators, oxygen supplements. A specialized team was hired to install medical alarm systems in the bedrooms. Security, previously focused mainly on protecting the property and its inhabitants from external threats, had now expanded its concept to include the physical and medical safety of everyone who lived in or frequented the mansion. Not all changes, however, were met with enthusiasm by all inhabitants of the house. Louisa, despite her sincere apology and apparent initial support, began to show signs of discomfort with the new dynamic. Accustomed to being the undisputed authority on everything concerning the house and Gustav's upbringing, she observed with growing unease the influence Josephine exerted over her son and husband. In the library, while distractedly flipping through a decorating magazine, Louisa couldn't concentrate. The sound of Gustav and Josephine's laughter, echoing through the corridors, only increased her irritation. When Theodore entered the room, she couldn't hold back the criticism she had been suppressing for days. "Don't you think we're overdoing it with all this emergency talk?" she asked without looking up from the magazine. "Gustav barely talks about anything else but Mrs. Josephine taught me this or Mrs. Josephine showed me that." Theodore sat in the opposite armchair, studying his wife's face. "I thought you supported the idea," he replied cautiously. "Supporting basic first aid training is one thing," she retorted, finally facing her husband. "Turning our house into an emergency clinic and allowing a cleaner to practically take over our son's education is another thing entirely." "A cleaner who saved his life," Theodore reminded her, his tone hardening slightly. "And I am eternally grateful for that," Louisa defended herself. "But there are limits, Theodore. Her place is not training our son as if he were going to become a paramedic instead of taking over the family businesses." Theodore took a deep breath, containing his growing irritation. "Gustav is 9 years old, Louisa. He has plenty of time to learn about business. Right now he's learning something much more valuable, how to be useful, how to save lives. What about the piano lessons he abandoned? And French? And etiquette lessons?" she insisted, counting on her fingers. "All these things that will be essential for his future as a business leader." "Our son almost lost his future at that dinner table," Theodore replied, his voice low but firm. "And it wasn't the piano, nor French, nor the damned etiquette that saved him. It was a woman we considered only good enough to clean our bathrooms, but who bothered to learn how to save lives." The words hit Louisa like a physical blow. She rose abruptly, throwing the magazine onto the coffee table. "I see your admiration for Josephine goes far beyond the professional," she accused with venom in her voice. Theodore looked at his wife, stunned by the insinuation. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Louisa? Don't play innocent. I've never seen you defend an employee with such fervor. I've never seen you so determined to change everything because of someone's opinion. Clearly this woman has some kind of influence over you that goes beyond gratitude." The accusation was so absurd that Theodore almost laughed, but the look on Louisa's face showed that she was completely serious, and deeply insecure. "Louisa, this is ridiculous," he said, standing to face her. "My respect for Josephine comes from the fact that she did what none of us were capable of doing. And if I am determined to change things, it's because that night opened my eyes to how artificial and empty our life was. Artificial and empty." She repeated, her voice rising an octave. "This is the life we built together. The life you always wanted." "The life I thought I wanted," he corrected her. "But almost losing our son made me realize how much we were living on appearances, concerned with perfect dinners, impeccable etiquette, the right contacts, while neglecting what truly matters." Tears of frustration began to form in Louisa's eyes. "And now you've decided that what really matters is turning our son into a mini paramedic and our house into a first aid station, all under the command of a woman who barely finished high school. It's not about schooling, Louisa. It's about character, about courage, about doing the right thing even when it's not convenient or comfortable." The discussion was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Roberta, the housekeeper, visibly uncomfortable, interrupting the couple's argument. "Excuse me, sir and madam," she said apologetically. "Mrs. Josephine asked me to inform you that the general staff training will begin in 15 minutes in the main drawing room, as agreed. She would like to know if you still intend to participate." Before Theodore could respond, Louisa spoke first. "Inform Mrs. Josephine that unfortunately we won't be able to attend. I have a terrible migraine and will need to rest." After Roberta left, Theodore glared at his wife with disapproval. "You are deliberately sabotaging something that could save lives." "I am protecting our family and our way of life," she retorted. "And if you can't see that, maybe we have a bigger problem than I imagined." With those words, Louisa left the library, leaving Theodore alone with his thoughts. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became palpable. Louisa began to avoid the areas where training occurred and rarely joined Theodore and Gustav for meals, preferring to eat in her room or on the terrace. When she inevitably crossed paths with Josephine, she limited herself to cold and formal greetings. The situation reached its peak 3 weeks after the incident, during a dinner where, exceptionally, Louisa agreed to join the family. The meal proceeded in awkward silence when Gustav, trying to ease the tension, began to excitedly recount what he had learned that day. "Mrs. Josephine taught me today how to identify a heart attack," he said, proud. "Did you know that pain in the left arm can be a sign? And that people often confuse it with heartburn?" Louisa placed her cutlery on her plate with unnecessary force. "Fascinating," she replied with sarcasm. "And when exactly will you use that knowledge?" "In the Montgomery Tech boardroom, when you're negotiating mergers." "Louisa," Theodore warned. "No, Theodore, enough. I've been silent for weeks, but I can't watch this anymore," she exploded. "Our son is being diverted from his proper education to play doctor with the cleaner. Our house has been turned into an infirmary, and you act as if this is normal." Gustav looked from one parent to the other, his face pale. The joy of moments before completely dissipated. If you truly cared about Gustav, you would understand that what he is learning is as valuable as anything else, Theodore argued, trying to remain calm in front of his son. "Don't tell me what Gustav needs," Louisa shouted, banging on the table. "I am his mother, and I will not allow this woman to continue influencing my son and my house." "What's your alternative, Louisa?" Theodore asked, his patience running out. "Go back to pretending we're perfect? That nothing bad can happen within these walls? That money protects us from everything. My alternative is to restore order in this house," she declared, standing up. "And if you're not willing to do that, then perhaps I should reconsider my position here." With those words, Louisa left the dining room, leaving Theodore and Gustav in silence. "Daddy," the boy called in a trembling voice. "Is Mommy leaving?" Theodore looked at his son, feeling a lump in his throat. How to explain to a child that sometimes love is not enough when people have fundamentally different visions of how to live? "I don't know, son," he replied honestly. "Your mother is confused right now. She needs time to understand that the changes we've made are for the better." That night, Louisa did not sleep in the master bedroom. The next morning, Theodore found a note on the bedside table. "I need space to think. I'm at the beach house. Don't look for me until I'm ready to talk. Take care of Gustav." Louisa's absence, which Theodore initially imagined would last only a few days, extended for 2 weeks. During that time, life in the mansion found a new rhythm. Without the constant tension caused by confrontations, everyone seemed to breathe more easily. Gustav, although he missed his mother, flourished even more. His sessions with Mrs. Josephine expanded to include other topics besides first aid. She told him stories from New Orleans, taught him southern expressions, and sometimes even prepared typical regional dishes for him to try. One afternoon, she introduced her twin sons to Gustav, Peter and Paul, university students who were visiting their mother on her day off. The three got along surprisingly well, with the young men treating Gustav like a younger brother, teaching him games he had never known in his sheltered life. Theodore, observing these interactions from afar, felt a mixture of joy for his son and sadness for the marriage that seemed to be falling apart. Several times he tried to call Louisa, but she didn't answer. The few contacts they had were through short formal messages, mainly about practical matters related to Gustav. It was on a Sunday afternoon, while the improvised family, Theodore, Gustav, Mrs. Josephine, and her sons, were playing cards on the veranda, that the phone finally rang with the call Theodore had been expecting. Theodore answered the phone, moving away from the group for privacy. Louisa's voice sounded different, calmer, more reflective. "I'm coming back tomorrow," she announced without preamble. "We're waiting for you," he replied, cautious, uncertain about the meaning of this return. "Gustav misses you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "And you?" she finally asked. Theodore chose his words carefully. "I miss you too. But I need to know if you're coming back to join us or to continue fighting against the changes we've made." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm coming back to talk," Louisa said at last. "These weeks have given me perspective. I don't promise I'll agree with everything, but I'm ready to listen. Truly this time." After hanging up, Theodore returned to the veranda with a thoughtful expression that did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Josephine. With a glance, she understood that something important had happened. Discreetly, she called her sons and announced that it was time for them to leave. "No, stay a little longer," Gustav pleaded, enjoying himself as he rarely did before. "We'll continue the game another day," Paul promised, affectionately ruffling the boy's hair with fraternal care. "It's getting late and Mom works early tomorrow." After the three left, Theodore sat next to his son. "Your mother is coming back tomorrow," he announced, carefully observing Gustav's reaction. The boy's eyes momentarily brightened, but soon a shadow of worry obscured them. "Is she going to make Mrs. Josephine leave?" he asked, revealing his greatest fear. The question caught Theodore by surprise. He hadn't realized how much his son had grown fond of the employee. "No, son. No one is leaving," he assured, sincerely hoping he could keep that promise. "Your mother wants to talk, to better understand what happened here while she was away." That night Theodore barely slept, thinking about what the reunion with his wife would be like. Part of him feared that the weeks apart had only solidified their differences. Another part hoped that the time for reflection had shown her the value of the changes they had implemented. The next morning, the mansion was filled with an atmosphere of tense expectation. The staff, aware of Mrs. Louisa's return, moved with redoubled caution, fearing that the old order could be restored at any moment. Louisa arrived shortly after noon, her elegant car parking in the mansion's circular driveway. Theodore and Gustav waited for her at the door. As she stepped out of the vehicle, both noticed subtle differences. Her hair, once rigidly tied back, fell in natural waves over her shoulders. Her makeup was lighter. Her dress, though still elegant, seemed more comfortable than the haute couture pieces she usually wore. Gustav ran to hug his mother, who received him with a genuine affection that surprised Theodore. Louisa held her son's face in her hands, studying him as if seeing him for the first time after a long journey. "You're taller," she commented, smiling. "Or perhaps I just didn't pay attention before." The question, seemingly simple, carried a weight of self-reflection that did not go unnoticed by Theodore. After a more restrained hug with her husband, Louisa entered the house, observing the environment with new eyes. The strategically placed first aid kits, the informative posters on the walls, the reorganization of some spaces, all this that previously deeply irritated her now seemed to pique her curiosity. "I'd like to rest a bit before we talk," she requested, heading upstairs to the master bedroom. A few hours later, Louisa came downstairs and found Theodore in his office. She sat in the armchair opposite his, her hands slightly trembling, a sign of nervousness she rarely displayed. "These weeks have been enlightening," she began. "At first I went to the beach house furious, convinced that you had allowed our home to be taken over by ideas that didn't belong in our world." Theodore nodded, but did not interrupt. "In the first few days, I could only think about how everything had changed, how our plans for Gustav were being derailed, how our life was unrecognizable," she continued. "But then something unexpected happened." Louisa paused, gathering courage for what was to come next. "In the second week, as I was walking on the beach, I saw a man fall in the sand a few feet from me. At first I thought he had tripped, but I soon realized it was something more serious. He was having a heart attack." Theodore straightened in his chair, surprised by the revelation. The people around panicked. "Exactly like us that dinner night," she continued. "Someone shouted for help. Another started calling emergency services, but no one knew what to do. And then I remembered Gustav's words in our last argument. Pain in the left arm can be a sign of a heart attack." Tears began to form in Louisa's eyes. "I don't know where the courage came from, but I approached and asked if anyone knew how to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation. No one did. The man was turning cyanotic exactly like Gustav that night." She took a deep breath, composing herself. "At that moment I felt exactly what you described. Complete helplessness in a situation where all our money, status and connections meant absolutely nothing. Fortunately, a lifeguard appeared and took over the situation until the ambulance arrived." "Did the man survive?" Theodore asked, engrossed in the story. Louisa nodded. "Yes, thanks to the quick intervention. And you know what else impressed me? The lifeguard was no one special, just a young man who had received the correct training and knew how to apply it when needed." She leaned forward, her eyes now dry and determined. "That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how different it would have been if I had known what to do. If, instead of criticizing Gustav for learning useless things, I had learned alongside him. And I thought about Mrs. Josephine, about how she turned her own tragedy into something that saved our son." Theodore extended his hand across the table, and Louisa accepted it, the first truly intimate contact between them in weeks. "The next day," she continued, "I did something I never imagined doing. I enrolled in an intensive first aid course in the nearest town. I spent the last few days learning exactly what Gustav and everyone in this house were learning. And you know what? It was one of the most humbling and gratifying experiences of my life." "Humbling?" Theodore questioned. "Yes, because for the first time in a long time I was completely ignorant. There were no privileges, no shortcuts. I was there, along with people from all social classes, learning basic skills that could save lives, skills that many of them already mastered, while I, with all my expensive and sophisticated education, had no idea what to do." A genuine smile, the first in a long time, lit up Louisa's face, and that's when I finally understood what you and Mrs. Josephine were trying to implement here. It wasn't about subverting order or confusing Gustav's priorities. It was about something much more fundamental, recognizing that there are values that transcend our social bubble, skills that matter more than appearances. Theodore squeezed his wife's hand, feeling a mixture of relief and admiration. "So you came back," and he concluded. "Yes, I came back to apologize. To you, to Gustav, and especially to Mrs. Josephine. I came back to join you in this transformation of our home. And if you'll have me, I'd like to contribute what I've learned." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was Gustav, accompanied by Mrs. Josephine. "Sorry to interrupt," the boy said, "but we have a surprise." Josephine seemed uncomfortable, clearly not expecting to find Louisa in the office. "We can come back later," she offered, preparing to leave. "No. Please stay," Louisa urged, standing up. "Actually, I'm glad you came. There's something I need to tell both of you." Gustav and Josephine exchanged uncertain glances, but entered the office. Louisa took a deep breath, gathering courage. "Mrs. Josephine," she began, "I want to sincerely apologize for the way I acted. Not just on the night you saved Gustav, but in the weeks that followed, when I resisted all the changes you brought to our home." Josephine's expression was one of genuine surprise. She would never have expected such humility from Louisa. "Madam," she began, but Louisa raised her hand, asking to continue. "Please, let me finish. These weeks away made me see how wrong I was. What you did for my son for this house is priceless. And I, with my pride and prejudices, almost destroyed all of it. Louisa then turned to her son. Gustav, you were right to admire Mrs. Josephine. She is exactly the kind of person worth admiring. Courageous, skilled, compassionate. I'm so sorry I didn't see it before. The boy moved, hugged his mother spontaneously. After a moment, he looked at her with hope in his eyes. So you're not going to send Mrs. Josephine away? Louisa smiled, stroking her son's hair. Not only am I not going to send her away, but I would like to join you in the training sessions. During my absence, I took an intensive first aid course and learned the basics. But I still have much to learn. She then turned to Josephine, extending her hand in a gesture of reconciliation. If you accept me as a student, Mrs. Josephine, I promise to be as dedicated as my son. The woman from New Orleans, visibly moved, accepted the extended hand. It will be a pleasure. Madam, Louisa, she corrected. Please call me Louisa. At that moment, Gustav remembered the original reason for their visit. Oh, I almost forgot our surprise. Mrs. Josephine and I made something to show Dad. But now we can show it to both of you. He handed Theodore a folder containing 5 drawings he had made, each representing a stage of the transformation they had experienced. The rescue during dinner, the first aid lesson, the new training center, a hug between him and Josephine, and a symbolic scene with a phrase written in his childish handwriting, "Courage is saving, not ordering." As his parents admired the drawings, Gustav continued explaining his project. Mrs. Josephine and I had an idea. What if we expanded the training beyond our home? What if we created a program to teach first aid in public schools? The proposal caught Theodore and Louisa by surprise. I thought we could use some of the money we spend on unnecessary things to equip schools with first aid kits and offer free courses, the boy explained with surprising maturity for his 9 years. Mrs. Josephine knows many professionals who could give the classes, and we could start with the schools in the neighborhood where she lives. Theodore looked at his son with admiration. The boy who once only worried about strictly following etiquette rules now proposed a social project with real impact. That's a wonderful idea. Son, he replied, exchanging a look of approval with Louisa. We can start planning that immediately. Actually, Louisa interjected, I already have some ideas on how we can implement this. During the course, I met a doctor who coordinates similar projects in underserved communities. He mentioned the lack of resources as the main obstacle. The sparkle in Gustav's eyes at seeing his mother not only supporting but actively contributing to his idea was worth more than any expensive toy or exclusive privilege he had ever received. 3 months later, the Blackwood Montgomery mansion was the setting for an event very different from the formal dinners it usually hosted. In the spacious garden, tents were set up to host the first Health and Safety Festival, organized by the newly created Save Lives Foundation, a joint initiative of the family with Mrs. Josephine. More than 200 people from different neighborhoods of New York City participated in free workshops on first aid, household accident prevention, food safety, and other topics related to basic health. Volunteer professionals, many of them friends of Josephine's children from university, conducted the activities with enthusiasm. In one of the main tents, Louisa, dressed in a simple t-shirt with the foundation's logo, jeans, and sneakers, demonstrated the Heimlich maneuver to a group of homemakers from underserved areas. Her natural elegance remained, but now it was accompanied by an authenticity and purpose that made her even more beautiful. Not far away, Gustav, wearing a miniature version of the same uniform as the adult instructors, taught other children how to make an emergency call correctly, speaking clearly, providing precise information about the victim's location and condition. Theodore circulated through the event, speaking with municipal authorities about the possibility of expanding the program to public schools in the city. He had already committed a significant portion of his personal resources to the initiative and was now working to create partnerships that would ensure its continuity and growth. At the center of everything was Mrs. Josephine, coordinating the activities with the same efficiency and dignity she had always demonstrated. Her sons, Peter and Paul, led teams of university volunteers who had embraced the project. In the late afternoon, as the event neared its close, Theodore gathered everyone for a brief thank you speech. With Louisa and Gustav by his side, he looked at the diverse crowd that had formed, people of different social classes, ages and life stories united by the common goal of learning to save lives. 4 months ago, he began, an incident in our family showed us how unprepared we were to deal with emergencies, despite all the resources we had. It also showed us that knowledge and courage are more valuable than any material fortune. His eyes met Josephine's in the crowd, and he gestured for her to join the family on the improvised stage. This extraordinary woman, he continued as Josephine reluctantly ascended, not only saved my son from a terrible fate, but saved our family from a life of superficiality and appearances. She taught us that true wealth lies in the ability to make a difference, to act when necessary, to transform personal tragedies into service to others. Louisa, taking the microphone, added, "The Save Lives Foundation is born from this learning. Our goal is to democratize life-saving knowledge, making it accessible to everyone, regardless of their social condition. Because nothing, no title, no bank account, no illustrious surname, is worth more than human life and the dignity of knowing how to protect it." Gustav, without asking permission, took the microphone from his mother's hands, drawing smiles from the audience. "And you know what?" he said with the spontaneity of children. "All this started because Mrs. Josephine saved me when I choked on a piece of meat." The simplicity of the observation provoked warm laughter. Josephine, normally reserved, couldn't help but crack a wide smile. "This boy is right," she said when the microphone reached her hands. "Sometimes it's the small gestures that initiate the biggest transformations. And if today we are all here learning from each other, it's because we understand that saving lives is not the privilege of specialists. It's everyone's responsibility." As the crowd applauded, Theodore observed his family, not just Louisa and Gustav, but also Josephine and her children who, in some indescribable way, had become part of his innermost circle. Different in so many aspects, united by values that transcended social barriers. On the mansion wall, visible to all event participants, there was a mural with Gustav's 5 drawings, now enlarged and framed. In the center stood out the image that captured the essence of their entire journey. Mrs. Josephine, with her simple uniform and determined gaze, applying the maneuver that saved not only a life, but transformed all the others around her. Above the image, an inscription in colorful letters summarized the philosophy that now guided that house and all who lived or worked in it. Here, saving comes before ordering. The Blackwood Montgomery mansion, once known only for its opulence and the social events it hosted, became a symbol of transformation and purpose. The invisible barriers that separated employers and employees did not completely disappear. Centuries of social inequality do not vanish in months, but they became more permeable, allowing respect and admiration to flow in both directions. Gustav would grow up with a worldview very different from the one his parents had originally planned for him. Instead of just learning to command companies and multiply fortunes, he was learning something infinitely more valuable, that true leadership comes from service, that respect is earned through actions, not titles, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected people. And it all began that night, when a humble but extraordinarily prepared woman ignored hierarchies and protocols to do what was right, proving that heroism often resides in those who clean the corners and illuminates the center. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Gustav and Mrs. Josephine has touched your hearts. For more emotional narratives like this, we have prepared a special playlist that you can find by clicking on the icon to the left. If this story about courage, transformation, and true values resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like on this video. Also, share in the comments if you have ever lived or witnessed a moment where someone unexpected became a hero. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the beauty of personal transformations. Until then,